we've made great strides in opening Cooper Union to a range of other collaborations, one with which you're very familiar with the Architectural League and the great lecture series that I believe Tony started under his deanship. But in tandem with that, working with the Public Art Fund for the upcoming Ai Weiwei exhibitions, one here and all around New York City, as well as collaborations with MoMA for next fall, and the Tito era monuments and civic buildings to which we are participant. For today, it is my great pleasure to announce also this collaboration with the Storefront for Art and Architecture with Eva Frank as its director. But everybody knows her in that capacity. What maybe not everybody knows is that she's also playing a vital part in transforming our pedagogical culture here at Cooper Union, and I'm greatly delighted to welcome her here as a faculty member and with her role being to transform the thesis year. So without further delay, let me introduce Eva to the stage, and with great pleasure to have her here and have you here amongst us.
Thank you, Nader, and for the introduction and actually for bringing me as part of this project that you are trying to start. As the director of Storefront for Art and Architecture, we have been trying over the last 35 years to ask questions that no one else does. Storefront was funded with the idea that we as architects, artists, policymakers, lawyers need to come together to try to ask better questions and to try to shape the world that is around us in ways that defy that question and problematize the power structures that are given. Over the last 7 years, at the leadership of this institution, we have been engaging with many different organizations and many of you, from students to architects in different degrees and ranges. Over these 7 years, I realized that many of us abandoned the fear of, is the book going to get lost, and tried to really engage the book, and yet we were met with a strange feeling that books were not meeting the expectations that we had. Today is also the opening of the New York Art Book Fair at PS1, where very few architecture books actually inhabit those tables. And one needs to wonder why. It is extremely hard to historicize the recent history, to actually look into the last 30 years and see what is that we have done as a collective to understand architecture, but also culture, and to start reflecting critically about those volumes, but also, of course, not only those volumes that we publish, but those volumes that are missing. What are the histories that we didn't write? What are the missing volumes of this history that is in the writing? Is somehow what this event here tonight tries to articulate. As an architect who believes that our responsibility, privilege, and task is to bring the social, political, and economic forces all together, I find very hard to find referential books that allow me to position ourselves into society in that veil. And so this month, in partnership with many different organizations, many of whom have representatives in this room, we are launching a project that I think is long overdue. The New York Architecture Book Fair is a project that starts this fall. It's going to be presented in June 2018 here in New York City, and that we hope is going to continue over the years as a way to really have a productive conversation around books, ideas, but ultimately architecture. So what we are going to do after, Max? What we are going to do as we try to launch this project, we are going to launch a series of initiatives. This conference here today is just the first one of them. This month, in partnership with the New York Public Library, we are launching a global survey. We are asking architects around the world to actually nominate books, monographs, critical essays, atlases, edited volumes that they consider that within their particular context constitutes a fundamental contribution to our global culture. The way in which this global survey is going to come together, the New York Public Library is going to bring all those different volumes together in a room in which a series of individuals are going to come, a selected jury member is going to come and select 100 of these books, hopefully thousands of them. These 100 books are going to be presented ultimately in June 2018 at the Storefront Gallery. And in a book, the Book of Architecture books. A selection of other books are going to be presented in June 2018 in a room in the New York Public Library. And so why are we interested in really having a global understanding of cultural production? In this room, probably we all will agree that we are all extremely Western. Even if we come from some Souths or from some other Easts or Wests, we have not been able to really engage with the global culture that we are building and constructing. And this project really tries to do so. So we invite you to actually send us the names of the friends, colleagues, and scholars that you believe have a particular knowledge of architecture and books in that context. What we are going to be doing in June 2018 is not only to present these 100 books at the Storefront, we are going to actually collaborate with a series of bookstores and cultural institutions and present within the infrastructure of the city that is already looking into books, a series of curated selections by architects and publishers so that people, citizens, non-architects can actually engage and enjoy books within the city. So this bookstore network, together with the exhibition at the Storefront and at the New York Public Library, together with a series of events and conversations in association with the National Convention of the AIA, the June of 2018 promises to be a great month for architecture books. One of the other things that are going to be happening from December until June is a series of salons. And one of the most incredible things that I always experience when I meet many of you is to actually arrive to your house and look into your books. We're going to enter into some of the private libraries of some of the most renowned and interesting scholars and architects in the city and have conversations about books, not necessarily over the last 35 years only, but obviously over the hundreds and thousands of years of architecture and literature. So within this idea that we are taking over New York, and through this timeline, we are going to try to bring a series of voices, and we do hope that you reach out if you want to participate in this project. We are launching this initiative with an incredible roster of participants, and I just want to thank everyone for willing to be part of this experiment of taking 10 minutes of their life to tell us a book that they believe constitutes a fundamental contribution to our contemporary culture from the last 35 years, and a book yet to be written. In some ways, a way to bring everyone into a space of consciousness and acceptance that the future is yet for us there to be built. And books are definitely a part of that. I want to thank the Storefront team, Max, Carlos, Ginny, and all the volunteers and interns for making this event possible, and definitely Elizabeth O'Donnell and Nader Tarani for hosting us so generously. And each one of you, none of you, needs an introduction. And without any further delay, I will tell you that the schedule is pretty tight. Some of our speakers, some of them actually might be here in different mediums. And with all that said, I just probably say, thank you, and let's the afternoon start. Thanks.
Yeah, just switching over. It's not that. Not my book. Okay. Thank you, Nader, and thank you, Eva. It was tough to decide on the book, but I decided that since Eva wanted me to be first, I'd start with a book that had an A as its in its title. And so, let's see how we do this. My book is Against Architecture. As my first choice in this first talk about architecture books, I've selected, perhaps surprisingly, a book not by an architect or historian, but by a French critic, literary theorist, and professor at NYU, Denis Ollier. It's titled fittingly as a start to this afternoon, Against Architecture, the writings of Georges Bataille, published by MIT Press in 1990. This book has an important for two moments and two reasons, and two widely spaced moments in time. The original work was published in French in 1974 under the title La Prise de la Concorde, first published in Paris in 1974. The book was dedicated to an examination of Bataille's early writings, and it was Denis Ollier who was asked by Michel Foucault, who presents this first volume of the Œuvre Complète of Bataille, published in 1970. And Denis Ollier worked on the manuscripts between 1967 and 1970, and then published his own series of essays called La Prise de la Concorde. The book was dedicated to an examination of Bataille's early writings and the metaphors of society and architecture they display. It was written, Ollier notes, in the first flush of enthusiasm that followed his foray into the papers left by Bataille after his death in 1962. Ollier had been introduced to these papers as the editor under the semi-benevolent surveillance of Michel Foucault, the first volume of the Œuvre Complète. Ollier's book's French title referred to Bataille's essay on the monumental significance of the Place de la Concorde and its central exhibit, the Egyptian obelisk, placed on the very spot that had housed the guillotine during the terror of the 1790s. Ollier's phrase, La Prise de la Concorde, recalled the more common Prise de la Bastille, the taking of the Bastille during those years. As later issued under the imprint of October Books, a series organized by the Editions of October and published by MIT Press, the book has been redirected, so to speak, by means of a graphic image. Let's go back here. A graphic image of the burning Cathedral of Reims in 1914 after the German bombing of the cathedral. Directed to an audience in architecture that has been, and to a certain extent, certainly in the academy, is captured by decades of French critical theory. And that, like Ollier's own book, has been increasingly republished in translation with a time lag of 10 to 15 years. In the wake of the events of '68, which seemed themselves to offer the potential for the practice of alternative politics, and were conducted by students whose reading of Bataille's La Part Maudite informed their critique of orthodox Marxism and communism, the way was already clear for a reading of Bataille in a different disciplinary context. Foucault's writing on transgression in the early 60s, often dedicated to other members of Bataille's Collège de Sociologie from the 30s, Krasovsky in particular, culminating in his presentation of the first volume of Bataille's works, had laid the intellectual ground. The widely circulated writings of the Situationists, led by Gabor, had before this stressed the post-war continuity with the contestatory practice of the Situationists and Surrealism, Dadaism and its offshoots, including Bataille. Accordingly, Ollier's book was edited and cited and utilized by the generation of '68 in Paris, from Roland Castro and Antoine Gombach to Bernard Tschumi. Italian enthusiasts even organized a special issue of the review Psychon around Bataille and Ollier's themes. Written in Rome between '72 and '73, the book was an instant hit among architects who were ready for discussion of their profession as what Foucault was to characterize as panoptical discourse, architecture is the disciplinary apparatus par excellence. Tschumi in particular, writing in several essays in the mid-70s, let's see if we got that one, especially in AD, found in Ollier's book and Bataille himself a manifesto for the corrupt, the defiled, as against the pure white myth of modernism, the despoiled and the desecrated against the healthy hygienists of the 30s. Koolhaas's ironic adoption of Roland Barthes' mythologies in the same issue of AD, the special issue of Surrealism edited by the late Dalibor Vézelay in '78, informed by his adaptation of Dali's paranoid critical method, published in Minotaur and with Lacan, seemed to open up the unruly practices of sacrifice and taboo to architecture. Even the biomorphic constructions of archigrams seemed infected by notions of the body as excretionary organs, while Bataille's master trope of the headless acephalus escaping himself through his erect and decapitated body seemed to find its analog in Barbarella's science fiction utopias. Such affiliations were confirmed by the eager collaboration of Schumi and Koolhaas in the architectural design special issue of Surrealism in 1978, where Schumi actually produced his first great manifesto of architecture and space, as inflected by Bataille. My book, that has yet to be written, Mannerism is not a joke. In thinking of a book not yet written, but is sadly lacking in the present gamut of critical and theoretical works, I select the theme of architectural wit, as psychoanalytically translated by James Strachey in Freud's celebrated work on Witz in the 1940s, and mannerism as permeated the practice of those who, unwilling to follow Team 10's neo-brutalist line endorsed by Banham and the Smithsons, felt the full burden of the anxiety of influence of the modern masters, the trauma of the war, and the need to expand the vocabulary of modernism, as Sterling would put it. In this context, mannerism, the art historical style invented in the early 1920s, is seen as mannerism, the strategic answer
the virtue of abstraction. And as a result of that, and because I'm a member of a generation that is probably in the last maybe 10 or 15 years of their capacity to work, that I think that we should, somebody, certainly not me because I have no idea how to write, should write a book about, sort of like in connection with what Tony said, what happened to the discipline, not to criticism or education or the practice, but basically to the trio of these three legs of the stool that constitute every practice, not only ours, but every practice, since '68 to today. And I subtitled this book with this notion that I thought it has to be in the times of investigations. It has to be really a forensic study. It has to be something that we all that lived it and were part in different departments or in different levels of dedication to one of these three different fields in which every discipline operates, have somehow the responsibility to understand how in this particular moment the discipline has lost a significant position in the development process. And by that I don't mean in the commercial development or the public sector development, but essentially in how the discipline has either contributed, given up, or essentially be pushed out of a fundamental role that it has always had. Two indicators of that, to me, have always been the fundamentally sort of signals or symptoms of the crisis are essentially the loss of knowledge base, the fundamental loss of scope, the giving up of enormous areas of fundamental integrated thinking to a variety of new practices that literally have emerged as a result of the withdrawal of architecture from those realms. I think that in a funny way, I think we all are responsible for that. But it would be great to recognize it in a way and to integrate it into what I called a forensic study of the withdrawal of the practice, not the practice, but the discipline from the influence in the culture and in the political and economic territory where it inevitably operates. That's 10 minutes, isn't it? Thank you.
There we go. Sanford.
Hey, hello, and thank you. I'd like to start by saying I agree implicitly and profoundly with the comments just made by Mr. Vignoli, and I hope that my comments will be seen in exactly that same light. I'd also say that it's a great pleasure to be part of any kind of event which let's just say, so unashamedly affirms the values and the culture of the book, and which even assumes that there will be importance and books in 30 years. I don't know if I believe it, but I'm sure on the side of fighting for it. So, I've written out my comments. in order to stay well within the time limit. Anyone in the room today who knows me no doubt expects the works I would bring today to not belong to the common canon of works on architecture and urban design. As much as I desired to defy that expectation, I regret that I could not do it. I miss all the opportunities, really. The main reason is that I do not hold the general classification of architecture to be a constructive one for our field today, as design rationality rightfully expands in every direction toward the much broader task of shaping and organizing environments of all kinds, including the terms of engagement through which these environments are perceived. And I think that more general term is quite in keeping with the developments that are taking place in our society today. 40 years of theory have brought one idea to the fore that arguably supersedes every other: that the business of design is to transform not only the physical worlds that impinge on our attention, but at the same time, the mechanics and modalities through which we perform or enact this endlessly mutating awareness of them. Past regimes have generally expressed this, although incompletely, as the production of subjectivity. In the contemporary jargon, one often refers these days to a cognitive turn, not only in aesthetics, but also in the sciences and in social philosophies. Quote, cognitive capitalism is one movement with which most here are no doubt familiar. The method of analysis, expanded far beyond its original Marxist formulation by Moulier-Boutin, that targets both human sentience and experience as the ultimate site of the action of power on us. Not only do we form and design our worlds, we form and design ourselves, and indeed exert these sculpting actions on each through and across the other. So the past work that has most deeply impressed me for its game-changing radicality in displacing standard models of how humans inhabit their worlds, how they intuit patterns, and resolve their broader existential relationships to them, is Stanislav Grof's legendary 1975 work, Realms of the Human Unconscious. As the words of his title willingly betray, Grof's is a work squarely in the early 20th century tradition of Sigmund Freud, Otto Rank, Carl Jung, and also, and importantly, of William James. Grof's study was the first not only to place the study of non-standard experience on an empirical footing, but to reveal a biological basis for human experience of the world outside the sensory, cognitive, and existential boundaries of a highly individuated subject and her physical, temporal, and moral location within this very same continuum. Grof revealed something fundamental about time and space, and not only about one's perception of it, that no one had been able to before in a scientific context. That time and space were apprehensible fully and directly across a vast spectrum of differentiation and de-differentiation, and that nearly all of our active understandings of space and time were built on a single narrow position within it, within that spectrum. Grof showed that humans participated in physical reality not only by receiving and processing sensations from it, but also, and primordially, by dint of their own historical experience as physical realities themselves, unfolded and unfolding within it. Non-ordinary experience had already been documented and rudimentarily theorized by the likes of William James, Margarita Lasky, and more prominently in the 1950s and 60s by Abraham Maslow, who referred to them as peak experiences. Peak experience was something that presented rarely to many people, yet not to all. It presented spontaneously, often in relation to physical places and strongly imposing spatial environments, and was typically accompanied by an overall feeling of continuity with being, and particularly with direct intuition of its organizing principles. On one level, this described a radical removal of the usual qualities of separation and distinction that make space and time intelligible in our everyday practical activities, but also a removal of the paradoxes that usually present when conjunctive and disjunctive sensations present simultaneously to us. The matrix upon which human experiential processing is built, the foundations of our intuitions of space, time, and the patterns they form, is that of a pre-differentiated sentience that is continuous with those so-called external space-time patterns its job is to pick up. And of course, this goes back to moments before the nervous system has entirely developed and differentiated and developed the second and third order filters and structures that some common parlance refers to in different ways, but also as the ego, et cetera, et cetera. This sentience is certainly rooted in our flesh, in the matter we are made of, and that connects us to all other matter. But it is probably more than that, too. Something like music or intelligence or organization that animates it, and this real and demonstrable sentience is never lost or forgotten. Perhaps this explains where the anomaly of human music comes from. Through thousands of case studies, Groff presents the extraordinary case for how access to these pre-differentiated states can provide insight that far exceeds the constraints of a subject's fixed and circumscribed position in the world. How the nervous system records concrete events, not our individual positions in them, and how access to these unadulterated records can provide knowledge of the most precise and expansive, but also transpersonal kind. The records I'm talking about, of course, is the way the body and the mind, wherever they mix and meld, actually records what it is later capable of reliving or remembering. To the question, what is space and where does it come from? The answer Groff's work suggests is that it is just what we wanted and expected, that it is us, only with the demanding qualification that it is specifically the place from which we come and to which we biologically return, even if we miss it throughout the entire duration of our lives, confined within the narrow framework of our utilitarian perceptual solipsism. So, if I were to signal an urgently needed work to come, something that might responsibly receive these insights 30 years from now and help place them at the center of our sensory culture in a world overwhelmingly organized around the life of our nervous system as we must all expect it to be, I would suggest that it would be something along the lines of Yale University neuropsychologist Bruce Wexler's book, Brain and Culture. No work in social neuroscience that I know so brilliantly describes the intimate design relationship between our inner and outer worlds as this one. since we as design thinkers, innovators, and experimentalists are tasked with providing user interfaces not only for our use of the world, but also, today, for the world's use of us. It would seem to be of paramount importance to rethink space, time, and matter, and their programming and disposition in light of the untapped aspects of our deep and mysterious biological endowments for sensing and thinking. The task will be to bring these to light in such a way that frees us, not once, but endlessly, as we continue to discover and tap its mysteries from routines imposed on us by the false demands of economic rationality, and everything else, of course, that goes along with that. If the essence of life is to transform, and the essence of design to direct and invent modes of transformation, we must embrace the non-distinction of space and time, subject and object, as an objective principle. Thank you.
You have to do. All right, thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's a great event. As many of my predecessors, I seem to have been find very difficult to find a book that responds to the request of Eva, that the book will be fundamental to thinking about contemporary culture of the last 30 years. For me, actually, what an architecture book is simply a book that changes the way we think about architecture. That means that many of the books that look like architecture books are actually not architecture books because they leave architecture more or less undisturbed. On the other hand, books that may not seem at first architecture may have the biggest effect on the way we think about architecture. I've always been affected by these kinds of books lurking at the edges of architecture. And I choose this one, this little book, 24/7, Late Capitalism and the End of Sleep of Jonathan Crary, published in 2013. It is a book about time, about the new regimes of time in which the difference between night and day, sleep and being awake had been steadily eroded since the 19th century. Even the format of the very small book with very few footnotes seems to capture the idea that we don't have time. We don't have time for sustained reading. It fits into a coat pocket, almost like a Japanese book that you're supposed to read in the train. It is really one extended essay, a series of reflections about sleep that keep sliding around between present events and deep history, particularly 19th century, but also ancient Greeks make an appearance along with a succession of philosophers, media theories, and industrialists. In the mode of the storyteller, he starts with the white crown sparrow, which is a bird that flies up for up to 7 days without sleeping while migrating. And of course, the US military, you may know that, has been deeply interested in this bird and trying to analyze their brain to see how they can engineer the sleepless soldier. And of course, after that, I think it will be also useful in architecture, I suppose. All these charrettes in the offices. Almost immediately, this exotic bird in the book is related to everyday behaviors and the fact that with every decade we are sleeping less and less, and all the various technologies that sustain this 24/7 mode of living. It is a relentless story, unnerving, a pessimistic view of the world, but equally forces us, I think, to rethink architecture. Architecture is not just the space, it's also time, and especially the space of time. And Crary describes the condition of the contemporary city is architecture. It's not by chance in that sense that the book is wrapped in the night vision of a skyscraper in which symptomatically more than half of the lights, as you can see, are on, a city in which people are increasingly waking themselves up in the middle of the night, several times in the middle of the night, to check their messages. Sleep is now fully integrated into a 24-hour day. I'm not saying that I agree with everything in this book. actually that's a crucial quality of a book that I will consider fundamental. When you learn from a book and at the same time and are provoked by it, and at the same time you find yourself disagreeing with part of it, that's when you are really affected in a deeper way. You find yourself rewriting it at the same time that the book is rewriting you. Carey's book, in that sense, rewrites architecture, or at least forces us, or forces me to think what we are doing in architecture. The book is simply an essay about the contemporary world, what Eva wanted, but in architecture we seem to have lost touch with the present, with what is in front of our noses, as if sleep is not an architectural topic. But if we are all living in a 24/7 world, whether we like it or not, within our beds, or our rooms, or our houses, or our streets, or our cities change too. Within those billions of messages we check in bed ultimately define a new kind of space. And that brings me to the book yet to be written, which I will call The City of Social Media, a book that explores the social media as a new form of urbanization, the architecture of how we live together. Social media has constructed a new kind of virtual city that is taking many of the functions of the traditional city. We now inhabit a kind of hybrid space between virtual and real, and this group of people are a good example. Where are they? Are they probably in a platform somewhere in Asia waiting for a train, and at the same time they are in another world, right? As with the arrival of mass media in the early 20th century, social media redraws again what is public and what is private, what is inside and what is outside. What is really amazing is that there was absolutely no social media before 2000. I mean, we have become so used to it, we realize it has a very, very short history. And with it, actually, a new space for design opened up. Through its multiple platforms, we not only communicate and collaborate with wider and wider groups, but we also refashion ourselves. Images, videos, text, emojis, stickers, tweets, GIFs, memes, comments, posts, and reports are deployed to construct a digital personality. Yet design in the age of social media is not what occurs in the space, or it's not only what occurs in the space of this little screen. Social media, this is what interests me, redesigns the city itself. It represents a complete transformation of the way we live, with huge implications for architecture. Early 20th century architects, people like, or architects like Adolf Loos, for example, lamented the effect of photography and the new illustrated architectural journal on architecture. Adolf Loos, for example, criticized his contemporary and ultra-rival Austrian architect Joseph Hofmann because in Loos' view his architecture appeared to be made for the camera. They were two-dimensional, had lost all tectonic qualities. It was difficult to tell them apart in photographs from their cardboard models, or so Adolf Loos say. And he himself, Loos, was proud of the fact that his own clients could not recognize their own houses in photography. A new generation of architects is now being asked by their clients to design a space that will look good in Facebook, in Instagram, in YouTube, etc. Even architectural competitions take into consideration how Instagrammable the winning design will be. Where a generation ago, design was concerning itself with the reception in the printed media, in newspapers, in professional journals, in magazines. And remember, it was only, I think, 2010 in the context of the Venice Biennale of Sana, where Rem Koolhaas did that installation where he used all these covers of magazines of Time, etc., in the 50s, which always have architects in the cover. And we all say, oh yeah, it's so sad now, nobody cares about us. But who cares about that now? When in fact, it seems like the concern now is with reception in social media. How many tweets, how many likes, how many followers, how many reports? The ultimate goal appears to be design going viral. And it's not simply the expansion of reception again that interests me here. The internet and social media are fundamentally redefining the spaces in which we live, our relationship to objects and to each other, even the physical fabric of cities. In what is probably now a very conservative estimate, the Wall Street Journal in 2012 reported that 80% of young New York City professionals were working regularly from bed. Millions of dispersed beds are now taken over from concentrated office buildings. The boudoir is defeating the tower. In his famous short test of Benjamin Louis-Philippe or the Interior, Walter Benjamin wrote about the splitting of work and home in the 19th century. Under Louis-Philippe, the private citizen enters the stage of history. For the private person, living space becomes, for the first time, antithetical to the place of work. The former is constituted by the interior. The office is complement. You are very familiar with this test. But the point is that industrialization brought with it the 8-hour shift and the radical separation between the home and the office or the factory, between rest and work, between night and day. And post-industrialization is collapsing work back into the home and takes it further into the bedroom and into the bed itself. Phantasmagoria is no longer lying in the rooms, in the wallpaper, fabric, images, and objects. It is now in electronic devices. The whole universe is concentrated on a small screen with the bed floating in an infinite sea of information. The bed is now a site of action on the wall stage rather than simply a place to observe it. As if in response, office spaces are now being domesticated with sleeping pods like these metro naps. The sharing economy, also reinforced by social media, is producing new urban typologies that blur public and private. The 19th century division of the city, of rest, and work may soon actually become obsolete. Not only are our habits and our habitat changed with the internet and social media, but predictions about the end of human labor, like this one in the 1950s for Vasily Leontief, are now finally taken seriously in the wake of new technologies and robotization. Economists wonder what kind of economic model this reality will lead to, from growing inequalities with vast amount of people unemployed to large-scale redistribution in the form of the universal basic income, which was considered in a referendum in Switzerland and rejected 2 years ago, but the fact that they consider should make us think. At the same time, as you know, multiple trials are now for the universal income are underway in California, in Finland, and in the Netherlands, and in many other parts of the world. The end of paid labor and its replacement with creative leisure. The interesting thing is it was already envisioned in utopian projects of the 1960s and 70s by Constant, Superstudio, and Archithum, including, of course, hyper-equipped beds. And now that it's up on us, it seems like we are not thinking about it. But meanwhile, the city has started to redesign itself. So, in substance, this yet-to-be-written book, in the spirit of Walter Benjamin investigations, develop a multidimensional portrait of the new social media city we are already inhabiting. Thank you very much.
Henry he regrets that he cannot be here, but he sent me his notes. His health actually prevented him from joining us. So I will try to do my best impersonation, what I know is totally impossible. He also found it hard to actually look into books before the 1980s, but he presented Borromini and the Roman Oratory by Joseph Connors from 1980. Beyond the thoroughness of its scholarship and the clarity of its exposition, this book is notable above all for the perceptiveness of its insight into the predicament of an architect as he struggled to impose his vision of an extravagant ecclesiastical facade on an institutional client deeply resistant to such display. It is astonishing that a scholar trained in the classics and far removed from the profession of architecture should have produced a book from which there is so much to be learned that is relevant to contemporary practice. So he actually says, this book, published in 1980, is technically ours concourse, although I feel strongly that it should be recognized. I am submitting also a more recent book deserving of recognition. Atlas of Noble Tectonics by Rezer Umemoto, 2006. The myriad images populating this book co-inspire with its seductively brief but not unchallenging text to draw the reader into territories of speculative thought, wherein diverse fragments of history, theory, and the author's own design practice are inextricably and provocatively commingled. This unabashedly didactic handbook is a small but well-crafted stone in the foundations of our contemporaneity. And so, of course, in his production of a book yet to be written, these combined works, architecture in conversation. When a work of architecture is significantly influenced in form, material and detail by its relationship to a pre-existing built work that is its neighbor, the two may be said to constitute a combined work, wherein each is seen to be in conversation with the other, a conversation that subtly but profoundly modifies the perceived identities of both. Although occurring in every era and in every culture, combined works produced in the past century of accelerated urbanization with its concomitant sociocultural upheavals have been especially interesting and provocative. This aspect of contemporary architecture merits the in-depth scholarly study and critical appraisal that it has not yet received. 3 alternative cover images exemplify the diverse character of combined works available to be documented and critically evaluated. Thank you, Henry. Is Diana in the room? Well, she should be in the house. We are going then to move into Eyal Weizman, who actually also sent us a video for his book. Eyal insisted, as many of you, that it is impossible to actually find an architecture book. And I insisted that he chose one. So let's see what he tells.
1, 2, 3. Hi everybody, I wish very much I could be with you in New York today. Very excited about this program. Very grateful to Eva for kind of asking me, to a certain extent forcing me, to think about the issues of architectural books. I have to admit that in the last few years I was very much reading in other disciplines, and though it was a challenge, an interesting challenge. Initially I wanted to present a piece of historical fiction by Javier Cercas called Anatomy of the Moment, a book that really interested me very much, a book that starts with a micro incident, the moment where Colonel Tejero enters into the Spanish parliament trying to enact a coup, and out of that moment the story of the history of Spain is kind of unfolded outwards of this moment. Eva rightly said, this is not an architecture book, and I said, okay. So I thought of something else to present to you, a book that actually was very instrumental for me, very influential on me. It's a book called The Case for Auschwitz, a book by a Dutch historian called Robert Jan van Pelt, now teaching in Waterloo, Canada. And the book is actually, that book is a legal opinion. It is a document submitted to court in a relatively well-known trial that took place in the very first days of this millennium. Robert Jan van Pelt was cross-interrogated on the I think it was the 10th and to the 12th perhaps of January 2000 by a Holocaust denier called David Irving, who claimed the Holocaust did not happen. So far so familiar, the Irving trial. What Robert Jan van Pelt did is provide the architectural case, a set of architectural evidence for it. So he collected plans and photographs and letters between planners and architects in Auschwitz. Apparently, there was an architectural or planning office in the camp, the only place that was probably forgotten, the only archive that was not burned at the end of the war, at the beginning of 45, when the Germans retreated from Auschwitz. They've burned all other documents except the architectural archive, thinking perhaps that might not be as important as other things. So arriving in Poland at the end of the Cold War era, Robert Jan van Pelt has access to those documents and start narrating the story of Auschwitz through its drawings, and looking at the transformation of the camp, just like anyone would look at any transformation of a building site. The camp was a continuous building site, continuously being changed, adapted, rebuilt, expanded. And in each one of those plans, there was something that was important. There was a kind of a political moment in each one of them. One of the nicest moments in the book is the moment where Robert Jan van Pelt is actually investigating the plan of the gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and notices something rather interesting. The door leading to the gas chamber has initially opened inwards. And that was a strange thing if you want to use it for that purpose, because of course the bodies of people would be packed against that door, and you would not be able to open it inwards. Then he notices a scratch, a kind of what architects do sometimes with a razor blade, they scratch out that line, that sort of quarter of a circle that signifies a door, and that is mirror inverted to be open outwards. And out of that detail, out of that transformation, coded not so much in what was drawn, but in what was erased, he's building a thesis on the fact that the camp was actually adapted to become an extermination camp, adapted to become a death camp, and that this particular room that later functioned as the gas chamber was used for other purposes previously. So that research later was central in the most intense moment, I think, historically, where architecture provided the kind of the basis for a legal case. So much hanged on the architectural evidence, and particularly that which Robert Jan van Pelt has collected. And I think that the debate, the cross-interrogation between David Irving, the Holocaust denier, and Robert Jan van Pelt, the historian, is the most intense discussion around architectural evidence. So they were looking at columns, and they were looking at air shafts, and they were looking, sorry?
You have done 6 minutes.
Okay. And they were looking at photographs, aerial photographs of it. And always what was interesting is that things are both, so your fingers in on it. Yeah. So that always the discussion is between the kind of the architecture of the building and the materiality of its representation. If it was the tracing paper with a erased door icon, or if it is the aerial images where there was a big discussion about the materiality of the film, of the negative that was taken by American Reconnaissance flight over that place. Of course, working in forensic architecture, and it was something that was both interesting and influential on me. And then Eva asked for another thing. So this is pretty much that. Again, The Case for Auschwitz. This is a book that is full of architectural evidence for probably the most horrific place on Earth. Yeah, so Eva asked me what I would do, what I would write next. And in fact, I wanted to say that I'm on a kind of sabbatical from writing, which is like an inverse sabbatical. Usually you take sabbatical, you don't teach or you don't work in an office in order to take some time to write. In the last few years, I could dedicate a lot of time to writing and publish a series of books, the last one of which is Forensic Architecture, Violence at the Threshold of Detectability. Kind of traces the work of the forensic agency that I've established and traces all different cases worldwide that we have been engaged in. But, of course, taking sabbatical from writing books and engaging now more in the work of the studio and in other challenges that exist around the Forensic Architecture project means that several ideas are developing. So kind of there's like 2 books that I'm more or less writing in my mind now. One of them is probably going to be called The Split Second, and it's really engaging with that trope of the split second in law. Often, as you know, the argument for the split second is a sort of the perpetrator last line of legal defense. When you show that a policeman has shot an innocent motorist or a soldier has shot an innocent person in a particular situation, I know it from the West Bank, but also in the US, they say it was a split-second decision. So I wanted to collect all those kind of split-second arguments and show how the difference exists really between sort of the defense position to say, well, this is only muscle memory, it is an instinctive behavior, an act of self-defense, but show how in the split second actually lie fossilized the long duration of a conflict. Why should a person appear as a threat simply for the color of their skin or for their nationality, as in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Why would that be, in what way does the sort of the long duration of political history might be fossilized in a split-second decision? So again, going through forensic architecture cases, several investigations where we have analyzed that and kind of theoretically unpacking that moment that is both interesting as a kind of a site of political action today, that is both important because of algorithmic decision-making, because of different forms of trading, etc. So that should be a long book, a thick book on a split second. And then I have a short book that I want to write on the history of the desert, on effectively following the desert line all around, or one of the desert line all around the earth, and telling the stories of these transformations that take place now through different processes and battles of desertification, looking also at the history of the desert line, political history of the desert, the way in which in colonial period it was pushed always southwards, as the desert was made green. This is kind of a trope that is both a Zionist trope, but also, of course, the trope of various other colonial powers, and the pushback now that comes about. So kind of like a political history of the desert line as it ran around the world. And that should be, because that's a very long span of time and huge space, that should be a tiny book. Anyway, thank you. Have a nice day.
Even in virtual form, AL is a tough act to follow. It's gratifying to see a full auditorium for an event dedicated to the book, and excuse me, like many others, I found the prompt given to us by Eva to be a difficult one. Of course, she very strategically chose this date of 1982, so all of the classic works were out. no delirious New York, no complexity and contradiction, no architecture of the city. And I think, like many others, I had this temptation to move out of the field, choose a novel perhaps, choose a work of philosophy. I thought about Georges Perec's book, Life, a User's Manual, a very architectural novel. I thought about Jane Bennett's recent book, Vibrant Matter, subtitled A Political Ecology of Things, that's had a big impact on my thinking. But in the end, it was a very easy decision. I looked around my bookshelves, and this book, which has had a huge impact on my thinking, and I believe it has had a significant impact on the field, for me was an obvious choice for one of the most significant books of the past 35 years. It is the Projective Cast, the book published shortly after Robin Evans's death. The manuscript had been completed when he passed away, and his wife, Janet, saw the book through the press, and it was published in 1993. I think there's a couple of reasons that I picked this book out, aside from its big impact on my own thinking. One of the things is that it's a book which I think is read profitably by both scholars and by practicing architects. And I think part of the reason for that is that Evans had a unique ability to write about the past and the present with an equal sense of urgency. Evans, of course, was a kind of skeptic. He was a convinced empiricist, and he was very, very skeptical of received opinion. One of the first chapters, called Perturbed Circles, that looks at the centralized Renaissance church, for example, says, well, in fact, centralized Renaissance church is not so centralized at all, that there's a kind of complexity to the geometric structure that is often overlooked by historians. Of course, the premise of the book is to deal with a paradox which is fundamental to our discipline, that architecture is a fully realized three-dimensional phenomenon that can only be addressed through abstract two-dimensional media. So examples like this full-scale medieval drawing, or these Boeing engineers who are drawing one-to-one profiles of wings, are efforts that can only scratch the surface of the architectural problem, which is solved by projection, that which navigates between the abstract two-dimensional techniques of architecture and its three-dimensional reality. The ground was laid for the arguments of the Projective Cast in an earlier essay called Translations from Drawing to Building, where Evans makes this sort of brilliant comparison. The image on the left is one of, you could find many examples of this, sort of academic paintings that narrate the story of the invention of drawing as told by Pliny the Elder, where Dibutatis, the daughter of a Corinthian potter, traces the head of her lover who is about to go off to war. Now, the image on the right is Carl Friedrich Schinkel's version of the same painting. And Evans makes a couple of observations, which I think are really quite brilliant and fundamental. For Evans, the image on the left would actually be, for Schinkel, the image on the left would actually be impossible, because you could never have a fully realized architectural interior with dressed stone and corbels without drawing having been invented already. So he necessarily sets the invention of drawing in this pastoral scene, and using the rays of the sun, which fundamentally turn the operations of projection into parallel projection, and interestingly enough, make the invention of drawing into a social exchange. Instead of this intimate interior exchange, you have a kind of social exchange where, again, interestingly enough, the person directing the operation in this case is a woman. So the book is a dense and very rich exploration of questions of projection in all of their various guises. At one point in the late 1980s, I briefly shared an office with Robin Evans at Harvard, where we were both teaching, and I was also fortunate to see some of these chapters given as lectures, including the brilliant chapter called Comic Lines, where he analyzes Le Corbusier's church at Ronchamp, pointing out that rather than a kind of personal, expressive, sculptural turn for Le Corbusier, this is in fact a highly designed and very precise use of both geometry and engineering, in particular pointing out the use of Guarini's conoid in the geometry of the roof structure. So that allows him to make a kind of counterintuitive remark like this, where he says, it is perhaps ironic and certainly interesting that Ronchamp exemplifies more advanced engineering design than any of Le Corbusier's pre-war buildings. Not more advanced construction, but more advanced design as defined on the drafting table. Again, this is the kind of brilliant and counterintuitive insight that the book is absolutely full of. I reviewed the book shortly after it was published, and I want to read the final paragraph of my review from the time. And the image here, if you can read the caption, is the trait for Philibert Delorme's Trompet in the Palace of Annay. A little study / balcony for the king that projects out into the courtyard. In chapter 5, Drawn Stone, Evans cites Delorme's elaborate description of the Trompet at Annay. Delorme justified the stone cutting and drawing operations, which required incredible virtuosity, by pointing to the difficulty of the brief, the provision of a private study for the king within an existing courtyard. Skeptical that such a circumstance necessarily required such an elaborate response, Evans observes that perhaps the difficulty was as much sought after as imposed. Delorme, he remarks, used the word difficult as a superlative. With that in mind, and in recognition of Evans's accomplishment, I think we might pay him the compliment of saying that he has written a difficult book. So, for a book yet to be written, the book which is yet to be written is unfortunately a book which will never be written. Evans was 48 years old when he died in 1993. I'm sure he had at least one more book in him, if not 2 or 3, although he did spend 10 years working on the Projective Cast. So my book yet to be written is whatever Robin Evans's next book would have been. And I think there's just a couple of things to think about if we want to imagine what that might have been. Remembering, for example, that his first book, The Fabrication of Virtue, was about the architecture of the Panopticon prison. And that Evans had a unique ability to connect problems of architectural technique with social questions. And I think he would have been a really valuable voice to hear from today. And certainly the other point is that passing away in 1993, he really didn't have a chance to reflect on architecture's digital turn. And if there was anybody, I think, whose insights we could have used to understand architecture's digital turn, it would have been Robin Evans. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. My apologies, it's taking me longer to get up here than my time slot. I hope I don't topple off here. Actually, I did topple in public. Actually, in an embarrassing situation, it was National Design Awards at the White House, thankfully during the Obama occupancy. And there's this photo op. And of course I had the honor of being next to the First Lady. And I did, in fact, I was nervous, so I started to topple over. And she caught me and steadied me and everything. And then I apologized to her and I thanked her profusely. And she has a great sense of humor. She says, yeah, if I hadn't caught you, I could see the New York Post headline tomorrow. First Lady fails to help helpless cripple. So anyway, she had a fine sense it was a great moment. First of all, I'm honored to be here, but also I think we should all congratulate Eva and her team at the Storefront. They have transformed the organization into something in the beginning days we could never have imagined. It's global and it's incredibly effective, and so I think we should give her a hand. Thinking about this, people are always, in interviews and so forth, asking me, so who's your favorite artist, or who's your favorite architect, or who's your favorite writer? And my answer is always, whoever pulled it off. I like such a wide range of artists and architects and designers and authors simply because I always look to what their concept is, what was their idea, what was their intent, what was their objective. And if they did pull it off, then I, of course, respect and love the work. So I felt a little bit like, what in my huge bookshelf of much admired books on theory and architecture, what would I choose? And I decided to pick Richard Castellanet's Dictionary of the Avant-Gardes because it's the most referenced book I have. My entire life has been dedicated actually to what the principles of Storefront are in essence, which is the fusion of the arts. I've been always very, very much involved in the integration of art, architecture, context, situation, environment, psychology of situation, and so forth. So in having a reference like the Dictionary of the Avant-Gardes, I realized that not only is Richard Castellanet's an irascible avant-garde person in himself, if you know him, but he has a prodigious knowledge of advanced work in multiple fields. So the Dictionary of the Avant-Gardes includes architecture, it includes performance arts, it includes literature, it includes poetry, and so forth. So since I often write in this space between the arts and these marginal areas and appreciate them so much, it's my first choice. He bought two editions. There's the Dictionary of the Avant-Garde one, and there's a second edition. And as I said, he is a prodigious writer. I mean, he's written probably 100 books and another 100 articles. And as I say, is an avant-garde figure in himself, in poetry, performance, and writing in general. As I say, this is just a brief overview of his multiple books. He's written definitive books on Philip Glass, on John Cage, and others, E.E. Cummings, and so forth. So I have found him just almost an invaluable resource as well as a good friend. We always argue. As I say, he is irascible, and he often has opinions you disagree with, but they're always so intelligently wrought that you have to engage in a dialect or an argument. They're always insightful. And these are two of my favorite quotes. I use them in almost every lecture. An idea that isn't dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all. And the second is from William Burroughs: artists, to my mind, are the real architects of change, and not the political legislators who implement change after the fact. And so what I'm sort of thinking of as is for this future book is the inclusion of progressive thinkers who are artists. Einstein, case in point, he said, when I examine myself and my methods of thought, I come to the conclusion that my gift of fantasy has meant more to me than my talent for absorbing positive knowledge. And that is, in fact, the essence of the hunch or the idea or the fusion of ideas that creates art, literature, music, performance, anything. So I thought that what might happen, excuse me, there's the old Dictionary of the Avant-Garde, so my proposal for the yet to be written is a third edition of Dictionary of the Avant-Garde, but in this case, a request for Richard Castellanos to create a short list of progressive artists and thinkers in other fields whose ideas qualify as most relevant for restoring global peace, social justice, economic equity, environmental protection, and general quality of life. Such a book could serve as the ultimate strategic resource for architecture. And so I gave the book a kind of a shape here, but I believe that by expanding that definition, including artists across the board, including physicists and philosophers and linguists, and other disciplines that, and especially then maybe forming a committee. I don't envy the discourse in trying to select the final works to be entered into the book, but clearly it would require some kind of a steam committee to make this decision. But I would hope this decision would include a broader view, and especially in the crisis of world politics and environment and everything else today, it would be interesting to take these major ideas. I mean, in a sense, all art, contributes to the cultural excellence of the world. It contributes to our quality of life. But it would be interesting to pick and choose very special observations by very special thinkers that would, in fact, do what this book says here, a short list of ideas to save the earth. Okay, thank you.
Is it the same presentation?
I didn't give it to
you.
you.
Oh, you didn't.
But it's,
Is this the right?
yeah,
stuff?
that's it. Okay. It's great to be here today, celebrating what could be more worth celebrating than the book. I too hope books will still be around in 20, 30 years, but today I think we still have at least a culture of books, among some of us, still vibrant, maybe a little nostalgic, but I'm hopeful that it will perpetuate itself. Thank you, Ava, for the invitation and for this provocative prompt. I hope what I've brought won't seem too old hat or deja vu, but this is the book I've chosen to talk to you about first, by Manfredo Tafuri, The Sphere in the Labyrinth, Avant-Gardes and Architecture from Piranesi to the 1970s. So it follows James Wine's presentation well, I think. So no architectural historian ever wrote more intensely about the contradictions of architecture in late capitalist society than Manfredo Tafuri, who lived from 1935 to 1994, or reflected more deeply on the tasks of architectural historiography, the writing of history. For years, his most accessible books, notwithstanding translation problems, were Architecture and Utopia, written in Italian in '73, translated in '76, and his earlier Theories and History of Architecture, written in '68, but not translated until 1980. and his survey, Modern Architecture, of 1976, English 79, together with Francesco Dalco, also had a fairly wide reception. Yet his sweeping dismissal of hopes in design under conditions of advanced capitalism, his rejection of any emancipatory form of architectural practice, especially in his polemical Architecture and Utopia, and his condemnation of postmodernist architects as frivolous and impotent, produced an impasse within the architecture culture of the 1970s and 80s, ultimately leading to calls to oublier Tafuri, to leave behind his pessimistic and lacerating critique. Meanwhile, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, published in Italian in 1980, not translated into English until '87, largely got neglected, in part because of its difficulty, erudition, and size, weighing in at close to 400 pages and with footnotes as lengthy as text, but even more because by the time it appeared, postmodernism was in full triumph in the US. To my mind, though, it remains his most richly imagined and complexly constructed book, and one that deserves to be reopened today. Oops, no, sorry, Matt, this is not the right thing here. Can we? Is Matt here, or shall I? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no. Okay.
That's why I came up. I thought it was the wrong one. Which one are you? Presentation?
Yeah, presentation. That's the one. There we go.
Oops.
Okay, sorry everyone. Second.
Just switching over.
Oh, all right. Oops. Okay, so this is the book by Tafuri that deserves to be reopened today, if only in order to experience the Venice historian's final, poignant farewell to the modernist utopia. The book also represents the first, and I believe the only significant effort to define and historicize the concept of an avant-garde, and more contentiously, a neo-avant-garde, specifically within the domain of architecture. Today, we may be disposed to consign the whole concept of avant-gardism to the dustbin of 20th century ideas. But Tafuri's problematization of the architect's role in society, her status as both technical expert and creative artist, offers a still essential reference point, as does his struggle to come to grips with the workings of ideology, even if this ideology now goes more under the name of neoliberalism than postmodernism or modernism. I don't have time to say much about the extraordinary introduction to this book, titled The Historical Project, and note the scare quotes around project, reflecting an acute self-consciousness which pervades this book. Suffice it to say, though, that it was written after most of the other chapters of the book and reflects the traumatic and belated impact of post-structuralist philosophy on the Marxian, Benjaminian foundations of Tafuri's critical thinking. The methodological doubts and uncertitudes about the project of writing history that Tafuri owns up to in this long and at times tortured essay are surely unique in the literature of architectural history, maybe other historical literature as well, and bring his earlier critique of operative criticism, operativity, to a whole new level of self-psychoanalysis, a project that, per Freud, is interminable. Despite Tafuri's acknowledgement of the provisionality of his work and the difficulty of giving historical research any finality, however, and despite the deliberately selective, non-comprehensive, and even disjunctive 9 chapters that follow the introduction, the tripartite structure of the book has a preordained arc and a decided sense of closure. This is a fundamental, maybe even fatal contradiction and flaw, albeit, in my opinion, also a deeply interesting and symptomatic one. Surprisingly enough, Tafuri begins his account of the modernist avant-gardes with Piranesi. The 18th century architect's wicked transgression of the formal codes and conventions of his day serves as the prologue to a story that then leaps, by way of a short chapter on Sergei Eisenstein, a devotee of Piranesi's proto-montage method, to the architecture of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Here too, however, Tafuri structures his story in an utterly original way, treating the avant-garde theater as a microcosm of the early 20th century metropolis, then exploring, or next exploring, the next chapter exploring, the peripatetic networks and institutionalizing events of an already globally distributed fledgling avant-garde, and then shifting focus from architect protagonists to cities, counterposing radical urban experiences in post-revolutionary Russia, skyscraper New York, and Weimar Germany. Yet the overriding, indeed redundant thrust of these chapters is to expose the illusions of modernist architects who put their talents and imagination in the service of capitalist or socialist bureaucracies, only to be disabused of their idealism. At the same time, the political questions Tafuri raises concerning architectural agency and instrumental technology are hardly less relevant today than 30 years ago. If his unsparing critique of his own day in the 2 concluding chapters, Architecture dans le Boudoir, the title taken from the Marquis de Sade's philosophy in the boudoir, signifying the enclave or the enclosure of architects in their own bubble world, insulated from the rest of reality, and the Ashes of Jefferson, now might appear dated to us, indeed shrill. The extraordinarily rich metaphoricity of the 2 dialectical figures that are paired in the title of the book, and also, paired in the title of the book, provide a leitmotif that weaves all the way through every chapter, as well as through the illustrations, which is what I'm trying to show you with this choice here, and adding to the book's compositional complexity and poetics, rewarding close reading. This is the final image in the book, a still from Peter Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, and here you can see the first and last images in the book, highly constructed, highly designed. It has been said of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake that you cannot read it, you can only reread it. The same might be true of The Sphere and the Labyrinth, and I commend it to any of you who are up to the challenge. Indeed, there are only a handful of books in the architectural corpus that can truly be called literary works. This is one of them. Okay. Well, my future book picks up where Tafuri's leaves off in terms of date, but it's not about the adventures of the architectural avant-gardes. It's not even necessarily about architecture per se, despite the title, which I'll show you in a moment. But it is also about architecture, architecture that is understood as one form of environmental production. My debt to Tafuri will be clear from this Benjaminian statement, which it comes from, the whole book is in a sense written under the sign of Benjamin's essay, The Author as Producer. And in addition to which, the Venice writer's historiographic imagination and scholarly rigor also remain a permanent inspiration. Yet I would like to characterize the approach of the book I'm about to propose to you, dear future readers, as a form of political ecology, a 21st century field in which the production of architecture features as one leading instance. So the rise of a global digital architecture, from postmodernist polemics to post-political practices to the search for new forms of architectural production. And I'm about to propose it to you, or present it to you in the sketchiest of forms, but this book will be published in the year 2025. It traces the last half century of architectural production, starting from the oil and energy crises of the 1970s, moving through the triumphalist epoch of neoliberalism, and concluding with the backlash against Trumpism. What's at stake is architecture's profound reconceptualization during this period, from a relatively circumscribed techno-aesthetic discipline during the 20th century to a highly diverse discursive practice today, and most broadly, as I've just indicated, a moment in the overall process of environmental transformation. It attempts seriously to take stock of the panoply of factors and actors, immaterial as well as material, technological as well as aesthetic, contingent as well as situated, non-human as well as human, that go into the production and consumption of built space, setting them into a roughly chronological but non-linear narrative. Not just the visionary schemes and ideas of designing minds, not just the affordances of new computer technologies and the expanded global reach of architectural work, but also the extraction and procurement of material resources, the subjectivity and affective experiences of laboring bodies, the fetish of commodities, and the distribution of power, capital, and intellect across an unequally urbanized planet will all be at stake and treated as equally important. Following Jacques Rancière's injunction to methodological indisciplinarity, to rethink the partition of the sensible, or in different words of his, to reframe the relation between bodies, the world they live in, and the way in which they are equipped to adapt to it, the architectural historian here makes bold to offer a counterhistory of spatial production, one that by no means denies agency or a disruptive potential to the aesthetic. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Just give me 1 second, I'll switch back.
How do I get to it?
Hi, everybody. The book I've chosen of the last 35 years, not written by myself, as the assignment was, is Francis Fukuyama's End of History. This is emphatically not a book about architecture, but about politics. Although you could say that given the totalizing character of its title, it's a book about everything, and therefore almost by definition about architecture too. I'm assuming everybody knows this book. It was one of the few bestsellers so far, I think, on the selection. The point of the book is very simple. I mean, it essentially, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent implosion of the Soviet Union, heralds a new period in history, no longer characterized by ideological opposition, but by a universal consensus that Western liberal democracy is the best and only and final remaining form of human government. That is 26 years ago. I think meanwhile we're seeing a world that is panning out somewhat differently, to say the least. Nevertheless, I do think that this particular way of thinking has had a profound influence. This was the world until 1991, essentially the West with an opposing bloc of communism, the presumed world after 1991, Western liberal democracy everywhere and with it, and that is in a way the unspoken subtext of the book, also the global acceptance of the regime of the market economy and of liberal economics. Now that, I think, has had a very curious and very surreptitious effect on architecture. This is the Maison Domino by Le Corbusier in 1914. This is the Maison Domino realized, of course, abundantly. But this, very interestingly, is an image from a Greek real estate website which informs people of the tax breaks you can harvest from leaving structures unfinished. Very interesting that, in a way, the ultimate success of the Maison Domino sort of equals its ideological defeat, curiously. And I think in that sense, that is exemplary for the position of modern architecture today, that precisely at the moments of its ubiquitous presence, it has become, in a way, an empty vessel. Manifestos, I think, have become a kind of quaint thing from the past that sort of ended somewhere in the late 1960s. I actually had a very difficult time selecting a book according to the criteria given, which I wanted to stick to. And in terms of architectural books that somehow made an effort to tell you what to do, I thought the last one was written in 1978 by my dear colleague. The one actually that fits the time frame, Jane Jacobs, is so pessimistic that it hardly qualifies as a way ahead. So my thesis is that in the last 35 years, no books of any paradigmatic meaning have been produced. It's quite interesting. So if you put the other A-list in, you get and you zoom out, you get a very interesting thing. You get a period of, let's say, utopian, paradigmatic, modern architectural production of manifestos, which is kind of neatly bracketed between 1914 and 1989, essentially running from the outbreak of World War I to the fall of the Berlin Wall, more or less the moment Fukuyama started to write his essay that later turned into the book. Now, let's look at the books of those years. 1914, the Futurist Manifesto, launched in Le Figaro, the beginning of, let's say, an aggressive embrace of modernism, even an embrace of the more violent aspects of modernism. And let's contrast that with the most important architectural book of 1989, A Vision of Britain by Prince Charles. it is very interesting. You know, you talk about the period 1914 to 1989. You get a period that ends aristocracy, and you get a period that starts the renewed reign of aristocracy. This is the assassinated, to the left is the assassinated Austrian-Hungarian monarch in Sarajevo. To the right is the aspiring heir to the British throne. Both men have a passion for hunting, but also so there you go. But also, in a way, they have a rather coherent preference for the same type of architecture too, to the point that you can actually wonder, if you juxtapose these things, whether the period between 1914 and 1989 actually really happened, or whether it was a brief interruption of an otherwise remarkably continuous history and a singular trajectory where, in a way, you know, the well-off, call it the aristocracy, in a way decides our value system. And this may seem like a gross exaggeration, it may seem incredibly far-fetched, but let's look. This is, you know this image very well, the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe estate in 1972, but it didn't stop there. It went on. It's France, Sheffield, Chicago, Dublin, Naples, Paris, Lyon. I mean, this could go on for a lot longer than 10 minutes. Nantes, Belfast, Glasgow, Lyon. A sheer endless list of demolition, where you could argue that, you know, if the 20th century is being erased, that probably finds its most potent manifestation in the erasure of its physical substance, very large modernist housing estates. So we no longer write manifestos, but that doesn't mean manifestos about architecture do not get written. They're generally written by others. They're generally written by others with an ulterior motive, who invariably add a nauseating adjective. You have green architecture, you have community architecture, you have social architecture, you have all kinds of architecture except architecture. They invariably replace our modernity by a different modernity. This is the sustainable home. It sort of meets the whole checklist of LEED, BREEAM, excellent, etc., energy, very responsible energy behavior, but it somehow doesn't really look modern. And you juxtapose the two images. This is probably an ecological crime. This is an ecological masterpiece, but somehow, somewhere, something has gone horribly wrong. And I think that is somehow the evil that a new book about architecture ought to hit the nail on the head on and really describe. Let's kind of look. Modernist housing estate, prefabricated, Plattenbau in East Germany. The interesting thing is that currently the way it's disassembled is actually remarkably like the way it was constructed, all prefabricated panels, which then get saved, indexed, numbered, they get transport, they get reused, and they get reused in a new type of architecture. This is, interestingly, a bungalow in East Germany, in the former communist East Germany, which is entirely made of the panels of a kind of demolished socialist housing estate. So in that sense, it always comes beautifully full circle that this type of new architecture sort of suspiciously resembles a very old type of architecture. Greetings from 1900. So to cut a long story short, the book I think that ought to be written, and it's literally within minutes from being finished, is a book that is an honest introspection into our own profession, how its role in the context of the market economy has changed, how it has become complicit in many cases, in many things it has argued against and vice versa, and how our simple profession has in a way become fiendishly complex and trapped in a web of ulterior motives where really doing good equals doing bad and vice versa. That it's the moral labyrinth that a simple profession has found itself caught up in. And that is it. Thank you very much.
So Richard generously offered us to actually visit him in his studio, and Max 2 days ago had an incredible session with him in which he talks about books and he responds to the prompt of this conference. As many of you know, many of the conference participants have contributed with books that are outside as signed copies, and I want to thank again all of you for your generosity, but also to realize that there are some really exceptional books out of print and extremely hard to find. What makes this event not only an incredible meeting of people and voices, but also of books and hands that sometimes are hard to see. So, with one more second, we are going to get there. Are we? Yeah.
In terms of the most important book of the last 35 years, I'm not sure of the date, but I would consider Towards a New Architecture by Le Corbusier to be perhaps in that category. There's a recent book by Louis Kahn, which is absolutely fascinating, and an architect who has certainly been enormously influential throughout the world. But there's so many books that could fall into that category. It's really hard to isolate one and say, this is the most important book of the last 35 years. But certainly, in my opinion, the work of Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn somehow would fit that category. In terms of what is the next most important book, I just got a copy of this, which has just been printed. And this is the first copy out, so I have to promote this, maybe not as the most important book, but important to me. And I would also think, as an unwritten book, perhaps Kurt Foster's take on the architecture of the 21st century, as far as I know, yet unwritten, would certainly be something I would look forward to reading. Well, you know, there's so many books on architecture that one refers to periodically. I have in my library a huge collection of works of Frank Lloyd Wright, which I always look at and never cease to be amazed by the amount of work, the quality of work. And I don't think people today are influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. But there's no denying his importance as an architect in the 20th century. Equally so, as I said, is Louis Kahn, Alvar Aalto, and many others. And unfortunately, the way in which architects perceive their work is mainly through books. I mean, I've visited many places, but I know more places through books than through personal experience. And that's why books on architecture are so important. Not only do architects, but students learn a great deal from reading books on both architects who are alive today as well as architects of the past. You know, one of the things that's, I think, most frustrating about being an architect is having projects which you work on for a long time unbuilt or not realized. And what do you have left? You have left the drawings, the models, and one way of communicating, you know, the ideas in that work, you know, is through publication. For instance, we have here this project which I did in 1987 for the site in New York on Madison Square Garden. What we have left is the model and photographs of the model. But it was a very important project for me, and it gives me pleasure to see it being illustrated again. You know, many architects we're all optimistic, and when you start a project, you hope to see it realized. But you know, so many things happen along the way that oftentimes we spend 1, 2, 3, 5 years working on something, and what you have left are the drawings. And so, one way of communicating the effort that's gone into it is to have it published one way or another, whether it's in a book or a magazine. I used to purchase books much more regularly than I do today. And perhaps one reason I buy less books is I don't have room. My library is full. All the shelves are packed. I have them stacked up. And a library in the living room as well as a separate library. But it's hard for me to get rid of a book. I never throw one away or give one away. I keep them, and then occasionally, you know, revisit it. I think that's probably true with many architects. You know, once you have something and you enjoy having it, it's not something which is disposable. It's a permanent part of your life. I have a signed copy. It's a paperback book. It's an autobiography of Frank Lloyd Wright with Frank Lloyd Wright's signature in the book. So I consider that, you know, a treasure.
I too want to thank Ava for this occasion. I think it's not just a contribution to architectural books and the value of books in our lives and our identities as architects, but also I have to say, to me personally, being here with all these amazing architects and speakers really lets me see the kind of temperature of both our optimism and our angst currently in the profession. So thank you. I have to say, I too probably interpreted this in a slightly different way than what Ava intended. At first I thought, what's the most meaningful book to me, and what's the most meaningful book to architectural culture? But in fact, I ended up going to a book that I came to late in my work, and I think it would be wrong to characterize it as essential cultural construction of architecture, but I do think it's important because it is, I think, an institutional critique that is important, and I think it's an institutional critique that comes in the guise of architecture history, and in that way kind of begins to put architecture on the couch in a way that needs to be put. So, from craft to profession, the practice of architecture in 19th century America, written in 1999 by Mary Woods, describes the construction of the architecture profession in the US. It dispels the prevailing notion that the profession developed under the leadership of men formerly schooled in architecture as an art, and shows instead its origins in craftsmen builders shifting their identity to professional architects in order to survive as designers and as supervisors of construction projects. Woods sees collaborators, partners, merchandisers, educators, lobbyists, unionists, rather than inspired creators, and documents both their contributions and the women and people of color in their ranks. The profession of architecture, in other words, was not originally what it later became, the arena of organizing architectural firms around the notion of aesthetic sovereignty, and one that distinguishes architects from constructors legally, economically, and socially. Read white class versus blue class, white collar versus blue collar. Or one celebrating through its designations as the aesthetic gatekeepers, the lone genius, and we might say the lone white male genius. Other books, such as Robert Gutman's 1988 Architectural Practice, A Critical View, and Dana Cuff's 1991 Architecture, The Story of Practice, examine the state of architectural professionalism in the late 20th century. Written before Woods' books, but describing the outcome of the transitions described by Woods, they both show a profession at the level of both the architectural office and the individual firm and professional educational institutions, struggling to organize themselves in a manner that fulfills their creative ambitions, their social relevance, and their financial security. And both still hold on to the idea that architecture should see its professionally defined aesthetic autonomy as its singular asset and primarily bemoan its structural inability to persuade the public of that value. The book that needs to be written, From Profession to Precarity, The Practice of Architecture in 21st Century America, would not only update the examination of the profession of architecture to its current condition, but would, as Woods does in her description of the start of the profession, move beyond the self-generated myths of our value, which is aesthetic gatekeepers. And I want to say here, it's not the aestheticism that's the problem, it's the singularity of the definition of the aesthetic and the idea that we are the singular holders of that gate. That's the problem. This new book would expose the consequences of the myths of that aesthetic autonomy. An analysis of contemporary practice would elucidate the consequences, on the one hand, of software and IT, globalism and outsourcing, the distribution of design expertise to and from non-architectural areas, the influence in social media, but on the other hand, the effects of professional organizations in society, think AIA, and architectural education in general in shaping a profession averse to risk and consequently averse to social relevance and financial reward. It would examine an on-the-ground effect of students who enter the profession knowing more informationally relevant information and software than their bosses, as well as the top-down effect of late capitalism and neoliberal politics on professionalism in general and the architecture profession in particular. It would examine the different ideologies that govern small, boutique, design-oriented firms versus large, multinational, multidisciplinary production or production and design firms, and the trends that put these into conflict with each other to the detriment of both and to the detriment of a positive definition of architecture as a profession. This book would help explain why the practice of architecture today leads to personal and institutional precarity and hopefully opens paths to future empowerment and relevance. Thank you.
So we are going to actually provide a 15-minute break so that everyone can actually go and get some refreshments and actually have a look at the books outside. And we are going to see you back at 3:50 here in this room. Thank you.